Story number 1.
The winter night was brutally cold, the kind that made the air feel sharp against your skin. I had the house to myself, a rare treat since my parents rarely left me alone overnight. They were visiting my aunt, whose surgery had gone longer than expected, and promised to return the next day. It wasn't my first time being home alone, but the storm raging outside had made me uneasy. Snow piled up against the windows, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. I tried to distract myself with the TV, bundling up under a thick quilt on the couch. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, providing some comfort against the eerie quiet that pressed down on the house. The house was old, and its age showed in the creaks and groans of the wooden floors. Normally, I didn't think much of it. Tonight, though, every sound felt deliberate, as though the house was trying to tell me something. I turned up the volume on the movie I was watching, hoping to drown out my nervous thoughts. The clock struck 9 p.m. when the first sound came. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft tapping, rhythmic and steady. At first, I thought it might be the branches of the oak tree outside brushing against the windows. But when I muted the TV and listened, I realized it wasn't coming from the windows. It was coming from the back door. I stayed frozen on the couch for a moment, straining to hear over the sound of the storm. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, but the signal was gone. The storm had knocked it out. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an animal, a loose shutter, or even my imagination, but I couldn't ignore the rising dread in my chest. Slowly I got up, wrapping the quilt around me like armor, and crept toward the kitchen. The back door loomed ahead, the frosted glass window revealing nothing but swirling snow. The tapping stopped as soon as I got close. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and cracking it open just a sliver. A blast of icy wind hit me, making me shiver. I peered outside, expecting to see a branch or something harmless, but there was nothing. The porch was empty, and the snow was undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything having been there. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my hands shaking. As I turned back toward the living room, a loud thud echoed from upstairs. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My parents weren't home, and we didn't have pets. There was no reason for anyone to be upstairs. I grabbed the fireplace poker and slowly made my way up the staircase, each step creaking beneath my weight. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the small nightlight plugged into the wall. I checked each room one by one. My parents' room, empty. The guest room, empty. My room, empty. I was about to turn back downstairs when I noticed something strange. The door to the attic was slightly ajar. It was always kept closed. Always. My stomach turned as I stared at the dark opening, the small pull-down ladder hanging just low enough to taunt me. Summoning every ounce of courage, I reached up and pushed the ladder back into place, shutting the attic door with a click. I hurried back downstairs, telling myself it must have been the wind or a draft. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house was colder now, despite the fire still burning in the living room. I grabbed my phone again, hoping the signal had returned, but no luck. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. I tried to focus on the movie, but every little noise made me jump. At around 11:30, I heard it again, the tapping. This time it was louder and more insistent, coming from the large bay window in the living room. My heart raced as I turned to look. The curtains were drawn, but the sound was unmistakable. 3 deliberate knocks, as though someone, or something, was demanding to be let in. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The knocking continued, slow and steady, before stopping abruptly. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard the faint creak of a floorboard. I spun around, clutching the fireplace poker tightly. The kitchen was dark, and nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt wrong. It was heavy, almost suffocating, like the house itself was holding its breath. I was about to call out when I heard it again. Footsteps. They were soft, almost cautious, moving from the kitchen toward the hallway. My chest tightened as I realized the sound was coming closer, heading straight for me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, but it didn't last long. A loud bang erupted from upstairs as though something heavy had been thrown against the floor. I bolted for the front door, not bothering to grab a coat or shoes. I flung it open and ran out into the storm, the icy wind cutting through my thin pajamas. I sprinted across the yard to my neighbor's house, slipping on the ice but not stopping until I reached their porch. I pounded on their door until Mr. Jenkins, an elderly man who lived alone, opened it. His face creased with concern as he saw me standing there, shaking and breathless. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out in a jumble. He invited me in, gave me a blanket, and made me sit by the fire while I caught my breath. When I finally managed to tell him everything, he frowned and glanced out the window toward my house. "You're not the first to say that," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That house has a history. The family who lived there before you, well, let's just say they didn't stay long. Said they heard things, saw things. The last owner claimed he saw someone standing in the attic window when no one else was home." I stared at him, my hands trembling. "Why didn't anyone tell us?" He shrugged. "Most people don't believe it. But after what you've told me, I'd say it's best not to stay there alone." I didn't go back to the house that night. Mr. Jenkins let me stay in his guest room, and I barely slept, jumping at every sound the old house made. The next morning, my parents returned to find me pale and shaking, refusing to step foot back inside. I never told them about the message I found later, scrawled in the frost on the living room window. "You're not welcome here." We moved a few months later. I've never been back. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The winter storm had been predicted for days, but no amount of weather warnings could prepare me for the isolation that came with it. My parents had left early that morning to attend a relative's funeral 2 towns over, promising they'd be back the next afternoon. I didn't mind being home alone. I'd done it plenty of times before. The house was familiar, and I found comfort in its creaky floors and the way the furnace hummed in the background. But as the sun set and the snow fell heavier, that comfort began to wane. By 8 p.m., the wind was howling, rattling the windows like someone was trying to get in. I had curled up on the couch with a blanket, a cup of hot tea, and my laptop, scrolling aimlessly through streaming options. The house felt enormous when I was alone, each shadow seeming to stretch and grow in the dim light. Still, I convinced myself it was just my imagination running wild because of the storm. The first sign that something wasn't right came when I heard the knock. It was faint at first, just a soft tapping sound that I thought was coming from the heater pipes. I paused my movie and listened. The knocking came again, this time louder and more deliberate, as though someone were rapping against the back door. I got up slowly, my heart beginning to race. The back door was in the kitchen, which faced the yard, a yard now buried under at least a foot of snow. I approached cautiously, flicking on the kitchen light. The knocking stopped as soon as I entered, and all I could hear was the wind whipping outside. I peeked out the small window above the sink. The backyard was empty, the porch light casting a pale glow on the untouched snow. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone having been there. Telling myself it was just a loose tree branch hitting the house, I made sure the back door was locked and returned to the living room. An hour passed without incident. I tried to focus on my movie, but my nerves wouldn't settle. Every creak of the house felt magnified, every gust of wind outside more menacing. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps upstairs, but I brushed it off as the house settling under the weight of the snow. Then came the scratching. It started softly, like something lightly dragging its nails along the front door. I froze, my eyes darting toward the hallway. The sound continued, growing more insistent, until it stopped suddenly. I grabbed my phone, dialing my mom's number, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. I crept to the front door, clutching the baseball bat I kept by the coat rack. I flicked on the porch light and peered through the peephole. The driveway was empty, the street beyond it blanketed in snow. I opened the door just a crack, shivering as the icy air swept in, and looked around. Nothing. No footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone having been there. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, closing the door and locking it again. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I returned to the couch, but I couldn't relax. My eyes kept drifting to the darkened corners of the room. my ears straining for any sound beyond the storm outside. And then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic creak like someone slowly climbing the stairs. My chest tightened. The staircase was at the far end of the hallway, out of view from where I was sitting. I turned off the TV, plunging the room into silence. The creaking stopped. I sat there, gripping the bat, my heart pounding. For a long moment, there was nothing but the wind outside. Then, from upstairs, I heard a door slam. I jumped to my feet, adrenaline surging through me. Someone was in the house. They had to be. I debated running outside, but the storm was brutal, and my nearest neighbor was half a mile away. Instead, I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Who's there? I'm calling the police." Silence. I waited, holding my breath, but no one responded. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I made my way to the stairs. The house was eerily quiet now, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your skin crawl. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hands trembling as I held the bat. The hallway upstairs was dark, the only light coming from the small nightlight my parents kept plugged into the wall. I could see that my bedroom door, which I had left open, was now shut. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My parents' room was to the right, the guest room to the left. Both doors were open, and I could see that the rooms were empty. That left my room. I approached the door, my pulse roaring in my ears. I reached out with one hand, hesitating before turning the knob. Slowly, I pushed the door open, shining the flashlight from my phone into the room. It was empty. My bed was untouched, my desk chair in its usual spot. Nothing seemed out of place. I exhaled shakily, relief flooding through me. But as I stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind me. I screamed, spinning around, but there was no one there. The doorknob wouldn't budge as though it had been locked from the outside. I pounded on the door, yelling for help, even though I knew no one could hear me. Then, the whispers started. They were faint at first, like a distant conversation just out of earshot. They grew louder, more distinct, until they filled the room. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, overlapping and echoing, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I backed away, my heart racing, and my flashlight beam landed on the mirror above my dresser. My breath caught in my throat. In the reflection, I saw a figure standing behind me. A tall, shadowy shape with no discernible features. Its presence was suffocating, the air around me growing colder with each passing second. I turned to face it, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, but the whispers persisted, growing more frantic. I clutched the bat, swinging wildly at the air, yelling for it to leave me alone. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room fell deathly silent, the air warming slightly. The doorknob turned on its own, and the door creaked open. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted down the stairs, grabbing my coat and boots on the way out. The storm was brutal, the wind biting at my skin, but I didn't care. I ran to the nearest neighbor's house, pounding on the door until they let me in. The next morning, when my parents returned, they found the house exactly as they had left it. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the snow outside, but I refused to stay there alone ever again. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. All I know is that something was in that house with me, and it didn't want me there. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snow had started falling early in the afternoon, blanketing the town in a thick, powdery silence. My parents had left for a last-minute trip to visit my grandmother, promising to be back the following evening. I didn't mind being home alone. I enjoyed the solitude and figured it would be a quiet night with hot cocoa and a movie. The house felt different as night settled in. The usual warmth of the living room seemed to fade, replaced by an unfamiliar chill that crept through the old walls. I told myself it was just the storm, the wind seeping through cracks in the windows. After all, it was an old house full of creaks and groans that I'd grown used to over the years. At around 8 p.m., I made myself a bowl of popcorn and settled on the couch with a blanket. Outside, the wind howled and the snow continued to pile up. The power flickered a few times but held steady. I turned on the TV, scrolling aimlessly through movies until I found an old thriller. About halfway through the movie, I heard it. A faint knock. It was so quiet I wasn't even sure it had happened. I paused the TV and listened. Nothing but the sound of the wind rattling the windows. I laughed at myself for being jumpy and hit play. Then it happened again. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. This time there was no mistaking it. I muted the TV and stared toward the front door. The sound came from the back door, the one that led to the yard. The thought of someone being out there in the middle of a snowstorm sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my phone, but the signal was weak, the storm disrupting the service. I texted my parents anyway, letting them know I heard something strange. Then, cautiously, I got up and made my way to the kitchen, where the back door was. The kitchen was dark except for the faint light of the porch bulb outside. The knocks didn't come again, but I could feel my heart racing. I peered out the small window by the door. The backyard was buried under snow, and the trees swayed in the wind. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone being out there. Relieved, I locked the door, though it had already been locked, and made my way back to the living room. I told myself it must have been the wind, or maybe the house settling under the weight of the snow. But no matter how much I rationalized, the unease lingered. About an hour later, as I was starting to doze off, the sound returned. This time it wasn't knocking, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunches, like someone walking in the snow outside. They started near the back of the house and made their way along the side toward the front. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. I muted the TV and strained to listen. The footsteps stopped. Then came the knocking again. 3 loud raps, this time at the front door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I got up, grabbing the fireplace poker for protection, and inched toward the front door. I flicked on the porch light and peered through the peephole. The porch was empty. The snow in the driveway was pristine, untouched. There was no one there. I locked the door, double-checking the bolt, and backed away. My mind was racing. Someone had to be messing with me, but how could they leave no footprints in the snow? The power flickered again, plunging the house into darkness for a few seconds before the lights came back on. That was when I heard it. Faint whispers, coming from somewhere upstairs. They were so soft I thought I might be imagining them, but the longer I listened, the more distinct they became. It wasn't just one voice. It was multiple, overlapping, speaking in hushed, hurried tones I couldn't make out. My stomach turned to ice. There was no one else in the house. There couldn't be. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and all the doors were locked. But the whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. I clenched the poker tightly, my palms slick with sweat, and forced myself to move. The staircase loomed ahead, its shadows twisting in the dim light. Each step creaked under my weight as I climbed, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The whispers led me to my parents' room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, a faint sliver of light spilling out. I swallowed hard, reaching out to push it open. The room was empty, just as it should be. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, but the air was cold, unnaturally cold, like stepping into a freezer. And then I saw it. The mirror above the dresser. Words had appeared, fogged onto the glass as though someone had breathed on it and written with their finger, "Leave now." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the poker. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving the room in an eerie, suffocating silence. My breath came in shallow gasps as I turned and bolted down the stairs. I didn't bother grabbing my coat or boots. I flung open the front door and ran into the storm, the icy wind biting at my skin. I didn't stop until I reached my neighbor's house, pounding on the door until they let me in. Mrs. Calhoun, my elderly neighbor, now took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words were jumbled, frantic. She calmed me down with a blanket and a cup of tea, telling me I could stay the night. The next morning, after the storm had passed, I went back to the house with Mrs. Calhoun and her son. The yard was undisturbed, no footprints anywhere. Inside, everything seemed normal, until we checked the mirror. The words were still there, faint but unmistakable. I didn't stay in the house that night or the night after. My parents were skeptical when I told them what happened, chalking it up to stress or an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw, what I heard. To this day, I can't explain it. All I know is that something was there that night, something that wanted me gone. Story. The end.
Story number 4.
The winter storm had arrived earlier than expected, blanketing the town in snow and silencing the world outside. My parents had left that morning to attend a wedding in another state, promising to return the next day. I had assured them I'd be fine alone. After all, I was 17 and had spent nights by myself before. But as darkness fell, I realized that something about this night felt different. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made every creak of the floorboards and every whistle of the wind seem amplified. I had curled up on the couch with a blanket, a bowl of popcorn, and my laptop. The flickering light from the fireplace danced on the walls, giving the room a cozy, if slightly unsettling, glow. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows in their frames. Around 9 p.m., the power flickered briefly before coming back on. I rolled my eyes, annoyed at the storm's interference, and went back to scrolling through movies. That's when I heard it, a faint sound coming from the back of the house. It wasn't loud, just a soft, irregular tapping. I paused the movie and listened, my ears straining to catch the noise again. There it was. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like it was coming from the back door, the one that opened onto our snow-covered deck. My heart rate quickened. It was probably just a branch swaying in the wind, I told myself. But as I walked toward the kitchen to check, the tapping stopped. I peered out the small window by the door. The porch light cast a dim glow over the deck, revealing nothing but untouched snow. No branches, no footprints. The tapping couldn't have been the wind. I locked the door, even though it was already locked, and returned to the living room, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I turned up the volume on the movie, hoping to drown out my nervous thoughts. But then came the knocking. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks echoed from the front door, loud enough to make me jump. My stomach dropped. Who would be outside in this weather? I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The storm must have knocked it out. I stared at the door, debating whether to answer it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no response, just the wind howling outside. Slowly, I crept toward the door and peered through the peephole. The porch was empty. No one was there. I locked the door and backed away, my heart pounding. Maybe it was kids playing a prank, though the storm made that seem unlikely. I tried to focus on the movie again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About an hour later, as I was beginning to relax, I heard it again, the tapping, this time coming from the window behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned around. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I approached the window, my hand trembling as I reached for the curtain. I yanked it open, expecting to see a branch or maybe even a bird. But there was nothing. Just the snow falling heavily outside, untouched and pristine. I slammed the curtain shut and grabbed the baseball bat my dad kept by the front door. Something was wrong. The house felt colder, the air heavy, like the atmosphere had shifted. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next sound was the worst of all. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. My blood ran cold. I was home alone. There was no one else in the house. Clutching the bat tightly, I tiptoed toward the staircase. The footsteps continued, each creak of the floorboards sending a jolt of terror through me. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the house, thick and suffocating. I stood at the base of the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. After a few moments of stillness, I decided I had to check. If someone was in the house, I needed to know. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the small nightlight plugged into the wall. I checked my parents' room first. Empty. Then the guest room. Empty. That left my room. The door was ajar, just enough for me to see the edge of my bed. I pushed it open with the bat, my pulse racing. The room was empty, just as I had left it. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. Maybe I had imagined the footsteps. Then I saw it. On my desk, scrawled in the frost on the window, were 2 words, "Get out." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the bat. My vision blurred as panic set in. I turned and bolted down the stairs, not bothering to turn off the lights or grab my coat. I flung open the front door and ran into the storm, the snow stinging my face and the wind biting at my skin. I didn't stop running until I reached the neighbor's house, pounding on their door until they let me in. Between sobs, I told them what had happened. They offered to call the police, but I refused. What could I say? That I'd heard noises and seen words written on a frosted window? It sounded insane. The next morning, when the storm had passed, I returned home with my neighbor's husband. The house was just as I'd left it, except for my room. The frost on the window was gone, and there was no trace of the message. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that something was in that house with me. Something that wanted me gone. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The storm hit harder than expected that night, swirling snow around the house and howling through the bare branches of the trees. I was alone. My parents had gone to visit my aunt in the hospital, planning to return the next morning. I was used to being by myself, but something about the winter night unsettled me. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was the way the house creaked more than usual. It was an old place, built in the late 1800s, and had always had its quirks: floorboards that groaned under pressure, pipes that clanged on cold nights. But tonight, the sounds felt different. They weren't rhythmic or mechanical. They were random, deliberate, like someone was walking through the house. I shook the thought off. It was easy to let your imagination run wild in the dark. I made myself a cup of tea and curled up on the couch, deciding to binge watch some shows to pass the time. The living room was cozy, the fireplace crackling softly, but the large windows made me feel exposed. Snow pressed against the glass, and shadows from the swaying trees outside moved eerily across the room. Around 10 p.m., the power flickered. The lights dimmed, then surged back to life. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just the storm. I reached for the remote to unpause the show when I heard it. A faint knock. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, but then it came again. 3 distinct knocks, slow and deliberate. They came from the front door. I froze, the tea warming my hands suddenly feeling too hot. No one would be out in weather like this. And if someone was, why would they knock so lightly? I hesitated for a moment before grabbing my phone and walking to the door. There was no signal. Of course. The storm must have knocked it out. The knocks didn't come again, but I felt a strange pull to check the door. Cautiously, I peered through the peephole. The porch light illuminated the snow-covered steps, but no one was there. The snow was untouched. No footprints. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. Maybe it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew better. I locked the door and returned to the couch, wrapping the blanket tighter around me. The fire had dimmed to embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. I tried to focus on the show, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. Then I heard it again. Not knocking this time. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming from upstairs. My stomach twisted. No one else was home. The footsteps moved slowly, pausing between each creak of the floorboards. I stared at the ceiling, my breath caught in my throat. Maybe it was the house settling, I told myself. But deep down, I knew the sound was too deliberate. It was someone or something, walking. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I could feel my heart pounding, my palms sweating as I gripped the blanket. I debated what to do. The logical part of me knew it could be an intruder, but my gut told me it was something else, something I couldn't fight with logic. I grabbed the flashlight from the side table and slowly made my way to the stairs. Each step creaked beneath me, echoing in the stillness. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the faint glow of the storm outside. The doors to all the rooms were closed except for one, my bedroom. The door was ajar, the darkness inside thick and impenetrable. I held the flashlight up, the beam trembling as I shone it into the room. It was empty. I let out a shaky breath, but relief didn't come. The air in the room was icy, far colder than the rest of the house. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I scanned the room again, the flashlight catching on something on the window. I stepped closer, my stomach churning as I realized what it was. Words were scrawled in the frost on the glass. "Get out!" I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The footsteps started again, this time running down the hall. They were loud, frantic, and coming straight for me. I froze, too terrified to move, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. I bolted down the stairs, not caring about the noise I made. My only thought was to get out of the house. I grabbed my coat and boots, not even bothering to put them on properly, and flung open the front door. The wind hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I ran across the yard to my neighbor's house, slipping on the icy driveway as I pounded on their door. Mr. and Mrs. Grayson, an older couple who had lived there for years, opened the door, their faces full of concern. I spilled out the story in a jumble of words, my teeth chattering from fear and cold. They let me in, wrapping me in a blanket and making me sit by their fireplace. Mr. Grayson grabbed a flashlight and a bat and insisted on checking the house with me the next morning. The storm had eased by then, and the sun was shining weakly through the clouds. When we entered the house, it felt eerily normal, like nothing had happened. But when we got to my bedroom, the frost on the window was still there. The words were gone. I didn't stay in the house that night, or for several nights after. My parents dismissed it as a vivid nightmare brought on by the storm and being alone, but I know what I experienced. Something was in that house with me, and it didn't want me there. To this day, I refuse to stay home alone in the winter. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
The storm had been raging since early evening, a relentless force of wind and snow that blanketed the town in a thick, eerie silence. My parents were away for the weekend, leaving me to watch over the house. At 19, I was used to being home alone, but something about that night unsettled me. The house was old, one of those creaky two-story homes built decades ago, full of character and little quirks that became more pronounced in bad weather. It groaned and settled in the cold, and the wind outside howled like a distant wail. I had locked all the doors and windows earlier in the evening, double-checking out of habit. Still, the storm outside felt oppressive. It made the house feel smaller, like the walls were closing in. I was curled up on the couch in the living room, the fireplace crackling softly, trying to distract myself with a movie. The glow of the fire flickered against the walls, casting shadows that seemed to move just a bit too much when I wasn't looking directly at them. My dog Max lay at my feet, his ears occasionally twitching at the sounds outside. It started around 9:30 p.m., the first knock. Faint and hesitant, it echoed from the front door. Max's head shot up, his ears perked, and he let out a low growl. My stomach tightened. Who would be out in a storm like this? I paused the movie and strained to listen. Another knock followed, this one louder and more deliberate. My heart began to race. I grabbed my phone and glanced at the screen. No missed calls, no messages. The power was still on, but my Wi-Fi had been spotty all evening, and my phone had no signal. The knocks came again, louder and more insistent. I grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table and walked toward the door, Max trailing close behind. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but swirling snow illuminated by the porch light. No one was there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. I opened the door a crack, just enough to look outside. The cold hit me instantly, biting into my skin. The porch was empty, and the fresh snow was undisturbed. There were no footprints. The wind howled, and I quickly shut the door, locking it again. Max stood by my side, his tail stiff and his eyes fixed on the door. "It's just the wind," I told him, though my voice lacked conviction. I returned to the couch, but the unease lingered. The knocks had been too precise to be random. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. The storm outside grew louder, the wind rattling the windows as if trying to get inside. About 30 minutes later, it happened again. This time the knocks came from the back door in the kitchen. 3 heavy, deliberate knocks. Max barked, his fur bristling as he ran toward the kitchen. My heart was in my throat as I followed him, gripping the flashlight tightly. The kitchen was dark, save for the faint glow of the stove clock. I hesitated, listening. The wind was deafening, but the knocks were unmistakable. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I moved closer to the back door, the beam of the flashlight trembling in my hand. Through the small window, I could see the backyard blanketed in snow. Like the front porch, it was pristine, untouched. The door was locked, but I checked it again, my hands shaking. There was no one there. And then I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the storm. Breathing. Slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the empty kitchen table and chairs. The breathing stopped. Max barked again, a sharp, frantic sound, and bolted back toward the living room. I followed him, my pulse pounding in my ears. The living room felt colder, as if the fire had suddenly lost its warmth. Max was standing in the middle of the room, his body rigid, growling at something I couldn't see. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift unnaturally, stretching and contracting like they had a life of their own. And then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye near the staircase, a figure stood. Tall and dark, its shape indistinct but unmistakably human. I froze, unable to move as it began to step closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The air around me grew icy, each breath coming out in visible puffs. The figure stopped just at the edge of the room, and for a moment everything was silent. Then in a voice that was low and hollow, it whispered, "Leave." My legs finally obeyed me. I grabbed my coat, yanked open the front door, and ran out into the storm, Max close behind. The snow was deep, and the cold burned my skin but I didn't care. I ran across the street to my neighbor's house and pounded on their door until the lights came on. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, an elderly couple, let me in, their faces full of concern. I told them everything, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush. Mr. Peterson frowned but didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "That house, strange things have happened there over the years. The last family left in a hurry, wouldn't say why. People around here don't talk about it much." I spent the rest of the night at their house, unable to sleep. The next morning, my parents came home to find me pale and shaken. When I told them what had happened, they dismissed it as a bad dream or my imagination running wild. But I knew better. We moved out of that house a few months later. I never went back, and to this day, I can't walk past an old house on a winter night without feeling that icy chill and hearing those deliberate knocks echo in my memory. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The snowstorm began in the late afternoon, transforming the town into a frozen, desolate expanse. I was home alone for the weekend. My parents had gone to visit friends in another state, leaving me to watch the house. At 18, I was used to being on my own, but the solitude that came with the storm felt heavier that night. There was no traffic outside, no neighbors shoveling their driveways, just the quiet hum of the heater and the muffled roar of the wind. The house, an old 2-story colonial, had its quirks, creaking floorboards, groaning pipes, and drafty windows that rattled with every gust. Usually these were background noises I ignored, but as the storm intensified, each sound seemed sharper, more deliberate. I settled into the living room with a blanket and some hot chocolate, trying to enjoy the quiet. The TV played reruns of some old sitcom, but my focus kept drifting to the windows where snow pelted the glass in relentless waves. I told myself I was just on edge because of the storm, but something about the atmosphere felt wrong, like the house was holding its breath. Around 8 p.m., I heard the first noise, 3 distinct knocks at the back door. I froze, my mug halfway to my lips. The back door led to the yard, which was enclosed by a tall wooden fence. No one should have been back there. I muted the TV, straining to listen. For a moment, there was only the wind, but then the knocks came again, louder this time. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed toward the kitchen, where the back door was located. My heart pounded as I approached, the faint glow of the porch light barely illuminating the frost-covered glass. I peered out, expecting to see a neighbor or maybe a stray branch tapping against the door. But the yard was empty. The snow lay untouched, a pristine blanket under the flickering light. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response, just the howl of the wind. I locked the door, though it already had been, and double-checked the latch. Telling myself it was probably the wind or my imagination, I returned to the living room and tried to shake off the unease. About an hour later, I heard it again. This time it wasn't knocking, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching footsteps moving through the snow in the backyard. My blood turned cold. I muted the TV again and listened, my hands gripping the edge of the blanket. The steps were faint but unmistakable, circling the house. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. Panic bubbled in my chest as I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was a neighbor checking on me, but why wouldn't they call out? Why wouldn't they come to the front door? Summoning what little courage I had, I went back to the kitchen and peeked out the window. The yard was still empty, the snow undisturbed. But the footsteps, those deliberate, crunching footsteps, continued. They were closer now, like someone was pacing just outside my view. I reached for the light switch, hoping the floodlights would scare off whoever or whatever was out there. But when I flipped the switch, nothing happened. The backyard remained dark, save for the faint glow of the porch light. The power must have been affected by the storm. Okay, I whispered to myself. Stay calm. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and shone it through the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the snow-covered yard. For a moment, everything was still. But then, at the edge of the light, I saw it. A figure. It stood motionless near the fence, tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the swirling snow. I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the floor. When I picked it up and shone it back outside, the figure was gone. The footsteps stopped. My mind raced. Should I call the police? Should I leave the house? But where would I go in the middle of a snowstorm? I decided to stay put, barricading myself in the living room with a heavy chair pushed against the door. I turned off the TV, not wanting any sound to mask whatever I might hear next. The hours dragged by. Midnight came and went, and though I didn't hear any more footsteps, the oppressive feeling in the house grew stronger. It felt like I wasn't alone, like the very walls were watching me. Around 2 a.m., I heard a sound that chilled me to my core, a faint whisper coming from upstairs. It was soft, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it was there. Words I couldn't make out, spoken in a voice that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I didn't want to go upstairs. Every instinct told me to stay put, to wait out the storm and leave as soon as daylight came. But the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, overlapping and blending into an eerie, incomprehensible murmur. I grabbed the flashlight and a heavy fireplace poker, my hands trembling as I climbed the stairs. The whispering seemed to come from my parents' bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the corridor. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. The whispering stopped. I pushed the door open with the poker, the flashlight beam revealing the empty room. Everything was as it should be. Bed neatly made, curtains drawn, nothing out of place. But the air was ice cold, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I was about to back out when I noticed something on the mirror above the dresser. Words, faint and foggy, written as though by an invisible finger. "Get out!" My breath caught and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The whispering returned, louder now, filling the room with its chilling cadence. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back in the living room. I didn't bother with the barricade this time. I just grabbed my coat and boots and bolted out the front door into the storm. The snow was deep and the wind stung my face, but I didn't care. I ran to my neighbor's house, pounding on the door until they let me in. Mrs. Grayson, an older woman who'd lived next door for years, took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I told her everything, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush. She listened patiently, then made me some tea and let me sleep on her couch. I didn't go back to the house until my parents returned the next morning. When we got there, everything seemed normal. The snow around the house was undisturbed, and the interior looked just as I'd left it, except for the mirror. The words, "Get out," were still faintly visible, despite my parents' insistence that it was just condensation or a trick of the light. I never stayed home alone after that night, and though I've tried to convince myself it was all in my head, I can't shake the feeling that something was there, watching me, waiting for me to leave. Story, the end.